Thanks for joining me. In this video I'm going to show you how to construct these regulation size cornhole boards that are not only lightweight, functional, and elegant, they're a great kickstarter for your woodworking business. Whether you're just starting out or you're an advanced woodworker, I'm going to show you my unique and simple process that makes these boards stronger, lighter, and classier than the average DIY board. This is a project you can do with basic tools and big box store material. I'll also show you how I save money on materials. So if you're making these for your business, the profit margin will be greater by reducing your costs. I'm also going to explain how I increase the value to the customer by providing visible craftsmanship in the assembly, the finishing, and the communication process throughout. So stay tuned. Thanks. First things first, let's go over the materials you're going to need to build these boards. I use 1x4 fir strips for the frame, and you're going to need 2 8-footers and 2 10-footers. I like this combination because it minimizes the amount of waste and leftover material, which results in a cost savings. I also use 1x4 fir strips instead of the premium grade 1x4s, and I find that when I pick through my local box store in the stack, I can find some decent ones, again reducing the cost. Remember to use proper lumberyard etiquette when you're sorting through the pile too. Don't leave that stack all disorganized for the next guy or the employee has to restack it. You're also going to need 3/8 inch plywood. I use sanded on one side because that will be your exposed surface and it'll allow for a better finish. The hardware that's required for this build are going to be 4 2-inch long 3/8 carriage bolts, 4 3/8 16 nylon nuts, 8 3/8 flat washers, and 8 2-inch wood screws for the leg assembly. Next step will be laying out your 1x4s, paying attention to any knots or bad areas, and then cutting them over on the miter saw. You're going to need 4 49-inch pieces, 4 25-inch pieces, 4 14-inch pieces, 2 22.5-inch pieces, which conveniently come from the remaining section of the 10-footers. So the next step is to rip my 1x4s to the proper width. When I buy my 1x4s, a lot of times there's going to be some chips in the edge. Maybe the edge is not completely straight, and I want to make sure my stock is true before I cut my dados and stuff like that and remove any areas. Like this knot hole right here, right on the edge, I'm going to end up removing that. This piece has a big garfoon in it. Yeah, that's a word, garfoon. So I'm going to rip my 1x4s to 3 5/16. I'll trim one side so I can get a nice straight edge, flip it, and then go to my final dimension. So the next thing I'm going to want to do is I am going to cut a rabbet in all of my side rails. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use my table saw and make a cut just like this. Make sure to set your blade height correct so it removes all of the waste material out of that rabbet. And you also position your fence in such a way so that waste material doesn't get pinched in between the fence and the blade. Back over on the miter saw, I will now cut a 45-degree angle on all of the side rails on one end with the outside of the rail facing me to keep any splintering that may be caused by the blade to the inside surface. Setting up a stop in the next part of this process to cut the rails to the final length of 48 inches and 24 inches respectively. So now that my frames are glued up together, my next step is actually to trim the plywood to be inset in the frames. These were cut at my big box store, these pieces of plywood, at 24 inches. So the frames themselves are 24 inches wide. And because I've dadoed these, made a rabbet, my plywood needs to be trimmed down exactly. With the plywood trimmed to width and sitting down in the rabbet on 3 sides, I will mark where I need to trim the length of this plywood. I will pull it out to the edge of the frame and actually use the edge of the frame as a guide for my router. I will clamp my plywood so it doesn't move, and I'll use a flush trim bit to trim off the remainder. You're going to want to cut a 6-inch hole in the cornhole boards, 9 inches down and 12 inches from the edge, or centered on your board. That is to the center of the 6-inch hole. I also make a mark at 6 inches, and I drill a hole so my router bit can go in. I'm using a circle cutting jig on my router. You could use a jigsaw or a hole saw, many different ways to do this hole. Over on the table saw, we're going to want to trim our legs to 2 3/4 inches wide. And this is another area that we can remove any bad spots like knots and waste. I use my storyboard and a template to mark out the ends to round over. Back on the miter saw, I'll just nibble off the corners of these legs, and that saves me a little bit of time on the sander. I'm using my drum sander here, I'm a shopsmith, but I have a wooden tool project in process that is actually going to be a 4x36 belt sander using an electric motor and 3/4 inch birch plywood. So stay tuned for that. Over on the drill press, I'll use a 7/8 Forstner bit to counterbore an area for the flat washer. I'll set up a fixture so I can have a stop set up at 1 3/8 and 1 3/8 from the side, so my holes are all in the proper location. And then I'll switch over to a 3/8 Forstner bit and drill all the way through. This is where it's important to have a storyboard and a template. I cut my legs at 31 degrees, but I've built quite a few of these already, and I also have a fixture for my hole location on the side rails of the board. It's also very important to have a left and a right. So placement on your miter saw, you're going to have a counterbore on the top side on 2 of the legs and a counterbore on the bottom side on 2 of the legs. Otherwise, your counterbore is going to be on the wrong side. I pre-drill my holes in the bottom of the legs for my leg support, and I'll also countersink as not to split the wood when I put my screws in. My lower support, I cut a 31 degree angle on one edge, and then bring it back over, and I'll make a pencil mark. So I have an exact mark where I need to cut my other 31 degree angle. And then it's just time for assembly. Now Now here's where it is important, and I'll illustrate the value to the customer. I've allowed the customer to work with the sign company for a vinyl graphic, which I'm going to use as a stencil to paint my letters in. I've allowed them to pay for it through the sign company and describe the font and the size and everything they need. I've also worked with the sign company to tell them the outside border of the graphic itself, but the customer gets the value and I pass that on to them. I don't raise the price of the vinyl graphic, and it also kind of eliminates a middleman for me. I've already made a video on vinyl graphic installation, made easy. There's a card right there if you want to go watch that. There's also a link in the description, and I explain this whole process in detail on how I install the vinyl graphics. Another way you can save money is if you know a friend or a family member, or maybe yourself, you do have a vinyl cutting machine. That is another way to increase the profit margin on these boards. I'm sure by now you guys are wondering why I misspelled homestead. It's actually a play on words. The customer's last name is spelled H-O-E-M, and they actually have a homestead. So this is actually a gift for the gal's husband, and I think it's actually pretty neat. They were married in 2009, so that's the EST 2009. Now we're ready for final assembly. I didn't show you the poly process. I use a Varathane brand water-based poly, and I'll put about 3 coats on it, the leg assembly and the board itself, sanding in between coats with 220, and then a final buff on the top with some paste wax. This is where it's important if you're going to be building these for your business. I have a fixture for the whole location and a little storyboard. Your whole location should be 1.5 inches from the top inside rail, and then also centered on the outer rails. Depending on where that hole is placed is going to adjust the angle of your leg assembly. It's time to install a carriage bolt in each hole. Also, putting a washer over that carriage bolt before you put the leg assembly in. It's kind of tricky getting the hole lined up and not letting the washer fall out, but once you get that, then you'll install another washer into that counter bore and then a nylon lock nut. Give that bolt a little tap to seat the carriage bolt so it's not going to spin. Use a ratchet to tighten it up. And you don't want to over tighten these because you're going to actually adjust how tight those bolts are so your leg assembly moves freely and doesn't squeak and doesn't bind. So there you have it, folks. The board is finished. It is ready to ship to the customer. It looks really nice. It's elegant. I like the dados, and I like the plywood inset into the frame. It's super strong. It's light. It's beautiful. I only have $28 into the set of these boards, and I actually sell these boards for $150 a set. Customer pays for the graphic, and that increases the value to them. Stay tuned for more videos. I have another video that explains how I sell wholesale sets of cornhole boards. Make sure you click on one of these end screens. Join me on my social media, and if you want to see more content like that, make sure you click that bell and that little red button.